Welcome to another quiet journey into the past, a journey far away from the rush of modern life, away from glowing screens and ticking clocks, into a world of silence, stone and soft candlelight. And tonight, we'll be traveling slowly, gently, into a time often called the Dark Ages, a name that suggests chaos and obscurity. But beneath that shadow lies something quieter, something more still, something deeply human. We're going to visit a place where people gave up everything: comfort, conversation, possessions, in order to find peace, to seek purpose, to search for something eternal. We're stepping into the cloistered world of medieval monks. For the next 2 hours, you'll be gently guided through the stone halls and cold chapels of early monastic life. You'll experience what it was like to wake before dawn, to pray 7 times a day, to live in silence, obedience, and simplicity. We'll meet Saint Cuthbert, a monk who sought solitude so deeply that he left even the monastery behind. We'll study the breathtaking Lindisfarne Gospels, a masterpiece not only of faith, but of ink, patience, and light. And we'll peer behind the veil of devotion to see how abbots and bishops quietly shaped power, politics, and the world beyond their abbey walls. This episode isn't about thrills. It isn't about drama. It's about slowness, stillness, about what happens when the world grows quiet enough for us to listen. So if you're in bed, let yourself settle. Feel the weight of the blanket, the rhythm of your breath. Let your muscles unclench. There's nowhere to be, nothing to do, only a quiet story told at a pace that invites sleep. And if you're still awake, you can imagine yourself in a small stone cell with walls cooled to the touch and a single narrow window letting in the gray light of dawn. Outside, a bell begins to toll, calling you to rise, to walk across the cloister courtyard, to be a monk in the Dark Ages. Imagine waking not to the sound of traffic or a phone alarm, but to the deep, sonorous toll of a bell echoing softly through stone. A bell that calls not to war or commerce, but to silence, to prayer, to a life lived away from the world's distractions. The air in your room, your cell, as it is called, is cold. It always is. The monastery's thick stone walls trap the night's chill. There is no fire in your room, no window glass, only a wooden shutter that stays closed against the wind. Your cell is barely large enough to lie down in a straw-filled mattress, rests on a wooden frame. Your blanket is woven from coarse wool, and your robe, the only one you own, is made from undyed fabric. Heavy and itchy against your skin, there are no paintings, no mirrors, nothing to distract the mind. You rise quietly as the bell continues its slow rhythm. You do not speak. You do not stretch or groan or hum a morning tune. There's no conversation here, only movement, deliberate, mindful, part of a ritual that has not changed in centuries. You are one of many monks living within this monastery. This is a Cenobitic community, meaning that you live in shared brotherhood, bound by a common rule, common prayer, and common labor. You and your brothers rise not to begin work or travel, but to begin prayer. The first service of the day is called Matins, and it begins long before the sun has risen, sometimes as early as 2 or 3 in the morning. The hallways are dim. Only a few torches flicker on the walls, casting long shadows across the cold stone floor. Your sandals shuffle softly as you walk through the cloisters, joining the silent procession toward the chapel. The chapel is simple. Its walls are bare. Its floor is worn smooth from decades of silent steps. The flicker of candlelight reflects off the wooden beams above. You take your place in the choir stall. The chanting begins, soft, steady, unhurried. The words are Latin, not understood by most common people, but you have studied them for years. The psalms are recited, one after another, in a low monotone. There is no melody here, not in a modern sense, only rhythm, repetition, and reverence. And as you chant, the world narrows. There is no future, no past, only now. Only the sound of breath and syllable. Only the cold stone beneath your feet, and the soft glow of candlelight on your hands. When the service ends, you do not linger. You return briefly to your cell, or sometimes go directly to the refectory, the dining hall. Breakfast is served without ceremony. A chunk of coarse, dark bread, a small cup of watered ale or thin broth. Perhaps, if supplies are plentiful, a sliver of hard cheese, but never meat. Meat is a luxury of the outside world, a temptation of the flesh. Here, meals are not for pleasure. They are for sustenance and nothing more. No one speaks. Instead, one monk reads from scripture while the others eat. His voice is calm, level, uninterrupted. You chew in silence, listening to the sacred words echo through the room. When the meal is finished, you return your bowl and cup to the shelves and proceed to your assigned labor. Because in the monastery, idleness is forbidden. The rule of Saint Benedict, written centuries earlier, teaches that idleness is the enemy of the soul. Every monk must have a duty, and every duty is a form of worship. You might be sent to the fields, where rows of vegetables grow in neatly tended plots. You till the soil with a wooden hoe. You bend your back beneath the rising sun. You pull weeds. You carry water. You harvest herbs. Or perhaps your task is in the kitchen, where you grind grain for bread, stir heavy pots of lentils, or wash the same wooden bowls over and over again. If you are skilled with animals, you might work in the stables or the dovecote. If you are educated, you may be assigned to the scriptorium, the monastery's writing room. Here, monks copy books by hand, the Bible most often, but also commentaries by early church fathers, ancient works of Greek or Roman wisdom, even medicine, astronomy, and poetry. You sit at a wooden desk, angled slightly forward. Before you lies a sheet of parchment, not paper, but vellum made from calfskin, carefully scraped and stretched. You dip a sharpened quill into ink made from soot and oak galls. You begin to write, one letter at a time, perfectly spaced, perfectly formed. You pause often, not to rest, but to breathe, to reflect. Each word must be an offering. Each page must be an act of devotion. Some monks add decorations to the margins, swirling vines, tiny birds, golden halos. Others illuminate the first letter of a chapter, filling it with color and light. But even the simplest manuscript is sacred, because it carries truth, preserved for generations, yet unborn. As the day continues, the bell rings again and again, marking the hours for prayer. Terce, sext, none, and later, vespers and compline. Each service has its own tone. Some are joyful, others solemn, but all are rooted in repetition. The same words, the same rhythm, every single day. You begin to feel them sink into your bones. You do not sing for pleasure. You do not keep a journal. You do not gossip or daydream or complain. Instead, you are given the gift of simplicity, of doing the same thing at the same time every single day. Some might call it monotony, but for you, it becomes peace. You begin to notice things, the way the morning light touches the chapel floor, the scent of rosemary in the herb garden, the creak of the wooden bench beneath you as you kneel. These small moments become your world. Not all monks came here by choice. Some were given to the monastery as children oblates, offered by their parents as a religious gift. Others joined after loss, widowers, soldiers, refugees from war. Still others sought penance, fleeing the guilt of a past life. But once inside, all are equal. You wear the same robe, eat the same food, sleep in the same kind of cell. There are no titles here, no promotions, no applause, only the quiet, day after day, year after year. And when the sun sets, you gather for compline, your last prayers, your last chants. You sing together and then disperse to your cells. Up, you lie down, the blanket scratches your skin. The wind whistles faintly through the shutter. You close your eyes, and perhaps, just before sleep takes you, you feel something like peace, not comfort, not pleasure, but purpose. Because this life, with all its hardship, is not about escaping the world. It's about transforming the self, letting go of pride, letting go of ambition, becoming quiet, so that you might hear something greater one day when your work is done. Your seat in the chapel will be filled by another, your robe passed down, your name written into the monastery's book of the dead. But your prayers, your pages, your presence will remain. But monastic life was not always the same. It changed subtly with the turning of the seasons. In spring, you worked longer hours in the fields, sowing seeds, pruning vines, watching over new lambs in the pasture. The monastery stirred with quiet energy. The garden came to life with greens and herbs. Bees emerged from hives built into the stone wall. In summer, the sun lingered longer in the sky. You rose at the same early hour, but the chapel was brighter. The cloister was warm. You might tend the beehives or gather herbs like sage and thyme, carefully drying them for medicine or winter teas. In autumn, the air turned crisp. Your hands cracked from harvest work, picking apples, storing onions, salting fish. You felt the year winding down, and with it, a slight melancholy, a reminder of time passing, a reminder of your own small place in something larger. In winter, life slowed. The cloister was cold, the hallways drafty. Ice sometimes formed inside your cell. Meals grew smaller. Your fingers stiffened during prayers. And yet, there was a strange peace in the silence of snow-covered ground, in the breath of mist, each time you exhaled in the chapel. Your robe, always the same, offered modest protection. Made of unbleached wool, heavy and plain, tied with a rope at the waist, you wore a hood pulled up in bad weather, and in colder months you layered your robe with a heavier cloak, rough but warm. Shoes were simple, sandals if weather permitted, sometimes leather slippers, always uncomfortable but durable. There were no mirrors. You did not know what you looked like. Your focus was not outward. Vanity had no place here. You groomed for hygiene, trimming your beard, keeping your nails clean, washing your face with cold water, but only to stay healthy, never to impress. And yet, for all the austerity, monks laughed, not loudly, not often, but quietly, softly, at the absurdity of spilling ink, at the chickens escaping their coop, at the way Brother Edmund always fell asleep during Compline. They were human, after all, and sometimes they wept for the sins of the world, for their own failings, for the memory of life before the monastery. A mother's touch, a sibling's voice, a path not taken. Those memories faded eventually, not forgotten, but softened, made distant by repetition, made smaller by the rhythm of bells. And within that rhythm came understanding. The longer you lived within the monastery, the more you noticed its quiet wisdom, how the hours were not chains, but stepping stones, how the silence was not absence, but presence, how the sameness of the days became a comfort, a place to rest your thoughts, to set them down like a heavy cloak. And in time, you forgot to count the days. You forgot to measure your worth, because in this world, no one earned anything. You received what you were given. You gave what you could. They weakened. They slipped away quietly. There was no fanfare, only a prayer, a procession through the cloister, a grave dug by hand. And then the bell rang once more. Life moved on. The monastery was not a place frozen in time. It was alive, breathing in rhythm with the world, yet apart from it. A place where one could, perhaps, learn to be still. And so you prayed, you worked, you listened, you watched light move across the walls. You sat in the chapel with eyes half closed and began to feel something vast and quiet settle into the space where your thoughts used to race. You had found what so many outside the walls still searched for. Not perfection, not glory, but peace. A peace built not from absence, but from presence, not from escape, but from surrender. And in that surrender, a monk lived, not in excitement, not in excitement, not in luxury, but in rhythm, in silence, in service. To live as a monk was to surrender yourself to a life of silence and repetition. But even among those who chose that path, some felt a deeper calling, a need to walk not only away from the world, but beyond even the community of monks, to live in true solitude. One of those men was Cuthbert. His name has drifted softly through the centuries, not loud like a king's, or fierce like a warrior's, but steady like a distant tide. To understand St. Cuthbert, we must journey back to the 7th century, to the northern edges of what is now England, a time of shifting kingdoms, of rising Christianity, of lingering pagan rites and wild open landscapes. Cuthbert was likely born around 634 AD, in or near what is now the Scottish borders. We don't know much about his family. Some say he was of noble birth. Others imagine a humbler beginning. Perhaps a shepherd boy wandering alone among the hills. And that is where the story begins. According to one of the earliest accounts, young Cuthbert was watching his flock one night when he looked up and saw a beam of light descending from the stars. He stared, transfixed. A warm wind stirred the grass. Far away, at that very moment, Aidan of Lindisfarne, a beloved Irish bishop, was said to have died. Cuthbert took it as a sign, a quiet invitation, a door opening within his soul. And so he left the hills and entered the monastery at Melrose along the River Tweed. There he began his training. It was a life of prayer, labor, obedience, much like the daily rhythm we've explored. But Cuthbert was different. He seemed more gentle, more selfless, more inwardly lit. He cared for the sick. He gave away what little he had. He volunteered for the hardest tasks, smiling as he scrubbed floors or chopped wood in the snow. Soon, he was traveling, walking from village to village, speaking not in Latin, but in the local tongue. He brought the message of peace, of humility, of love. He was patient, kind, curious. He listened, and the people loved him for it. But even in those early days, something stirred inside him, a longing not just for silence, but for solitude. And that longing grew. Later, Cuthbert was sent to Lindisfarne, a tidal island off the northeast coast. Surrounded by shifting waters, Lindisfarne was already a sacred place, a monastery founded by Irish missionaries, and home to both prayer and scholarship. Here, Cuthbert rose to the rank of prior, overseeing the monks and their daily rhythm. He was fair, but firm, gentle, but unbending in matters of discipline. Yet the island, peaceful as it was, became too crowded for his spirit. He craved something quieter, and so he left again. This time, he journeyed to Inner Farne, a small, wind-swept rock farther out to sea, barren, remote, home only to birds, seals, and storm. There, he built a cell, round and low, made of stone. It had no windows, no warmth, only a tiny slit in the wall to let in food and water. He slept on the floor. He grew his own vegetables. He prayed. The solitude was complete. And in that solitude, stories began to form. They say that once he stood waist deep in the freezing North Sea, chanting the Psalms for hours. When he returned to land, 2 otters came to dry his feet with their fur, warming him with their breath. Another tale tells of him calming a storm with prayer. Another of animals gathering around his hut, sensing something peaceful in his presence. These stories are gentle, not grand miracles, not thunder or fire, but moments of harmony between man, nature, and something eternal. But solitude does not silence temptation. Even in his stone hut, Cuthbert wrestled with hunger, with pride, with doubt. What if his isolation was not devotion, but vanity? What if his visions were not divine, but delusions? What if the world needed him, and he was hiding? These were the temptations that lingered, not of the flesh, but of the spirit. Still, he stayed. Years passed. The wind carved grooves into the stones. His beard grew long. His voice grew soft. His fame spread. Eventually, he was called back. In the year 684, he was chosen to become Bishop of Lindisfarne. He refused, but they insisted. A delegation traveled to Inner Farn and knelt outside his hut, begging him to return. Not for his sake, but for theirs. Cuthbert wept and accepted. He returned to Lindisfarne, not as a monk, but as a bishop. He wore finer robes. He carried a staff. He blessed kings. He preached to crowds. But his heart remained on the island. After just 2 years, he stepped down, returned to his cell on Inner Farn, prepared quietly for the end. In 687, he died, alone but not forgotten. They say his face looked peaceful, his hands folded, a small smile resting beneath his beard. He was buried on Lindisfarne, near the chapel he once prayed in. But that was only the beginning. Years later, when the Vikings threatened the island, the monks fled with his body. They carried him from place to place, always moving, always hiding, until they reached Durham, where a great cathedral would eventually rise above his tomb. When his coffin was opened, they found his body uncorrupted, soft, whole, untouched by decay. It was a miracle, they said, proof of sainthood. And so, Saint Cuthbert was born. But beyond the relics, beyond the golden shrine, the real miracle may be this, that a man could leave so little behind, and yet leave behind so much. Cuthbert wrote no books, fought no battles, built no empire, but he lived gently, spoke humbly, loved deeply, and in doing so, changed everything around him. Today, his bones rest quietly behind the high altar of Durham Cathedral. Pilgrims still visit. Candles are still lit. Chants still echo. But if you truly want to find him, you must go farther, to the edge of the sea, where the waves crash against the rock, where seabirds cry and the wind howls across the grass, where silence stretches long and deep. There, if you listen, you might still hear him, praying, weeping, waiting. But Cuthbert's story did not end with his death. In some ways, it had only just begun. For in the medieval world, death was not a conclusion. It was a beginning of a different kind of life, a life in relics, in memory, in veneration. After his passing, the monks of Lindisfarne cared for his tomb, as they had cared for him. They sang psalms over it. They lit candles. They tended the chapel around it, sweeping the stone floor, washing the altar linens, arranging the flowers. A quiet reverence settled over the place, but peace did not last. In the 9th century, Viking raids began to scour the English coast. The island of Lindisfarne, once remote and holy, became vulnerable. The monks knew they could not protect the sacred site, and so, in the year 875, they made a decision. They would leave, but not empty-handed. They opened Cuthbert's tomb, and to their astonishment, and perhaps their fear, they found his body still intact, his skin soft, his face serene, no trace of decay. It was declared a miracle. With great care, they placed his remains in a wooden coffin. They wrapped it in linen. They gathered his gospel book, his wooden cross, and a few other relics, and then they fled. For 7 years, the monks wandered the north, carrying his coffin across rivers and valleys, over hills and through towns. They stopped in small churches, slept in barns, hid in forests, all while guarding the quiet figure who had once walked among them. To carry a saint was no small task, not physically, but spiritually. It meant becoming custodians of something greater than themselves, not just a body, but a symbol of devotion, of purity, of endurance. Eventually, they reached the rocky outcrop of Chesterless Street, where they rested for nearly a century. There, Cuthbert's coffin became the centerpiece of a growing church. Pilgrims came from across the region, some seeking healing, others forgiveness. They brought candles, coins, linen, carved offerings. They prayed, touched the wood, knelt for hours. And Cuthbert, in death, became more powerful than he ever was in life. But the story continued still. In the early 11th century, the monks moved once more, this time to the rising city of Durham, where they built a great stone church atop a hill. There, beneath the rived vaults and stained glass, they placed his coffin again. And when Durham Cathedral was rebuilt in Norman splendor just decades later, they reinterred him once more behind the high altar in a shrine of gold and stone. And there, he rests still, but it was not just the physical body that lived on. Cuthbert's way of being, his gentleness, his solitude, his humility, became a model for holy life. Other hermits followed his example, seeking the windswept peace of the outer islands. Church leaders referenced him in sermons. His image appeared in manuscripts, often holding a staff, or surrounded by animals, or praying beneath a starry sky. He became the patron saint of Northumbria, protector of the northern lands. His feast day, March 20th, was celebrated with soft hymns and long vigils. And over the centuries, his relics continue to draw the faithful, even as kingdoms changed, as churches rose and fell. During the Reformation, when relics were destroyed and saints declared false idols, Cuthbert's tomb was opened one final time. But even then, those who saw it reportedly stepped back in silence. His body, even then, was said to remain whole. No one knows for sure. The tomb was resealed and remains so to this day. But perhaps the most enduring part of Cuthbert is not what's buried in stone, but what still lingers in the wind. If you walk the coast of Northumbria today, the rocks and dunes, the sea thrift and heather, you may feel what he felt, that stillness, that longing for simplicity, that desire to listen more and speak less. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy he left behind, not in miracle or shrine, but in example, in showing that one could live without wealth, without fame, without noise, and in doing so, become unforgettable. Day after day, year after year, some believe he worked entirely alone. Others suggest he had help, perhaps a scribe, a binder, a pigment grinder. But the prevailing belief remains that Edfrith not only oversaw the work, but drew it, letter by letter, line by line, not a team, not a workshop, but one man, one pair of hands, one quiet breath behind every word. Each gospel opens with a portrait of the evangelist, seated, quill in hand, halo behind the head. Matthew, often with an angel. Mark, with a lion. Luke, accompanied by an ox. John, beside an eagle. These symbols were not chosen at random. They come from early Christian visions. The four beasts around the throne of heaven in the book of Revelation. They represent different aspects of Christ's nature: human, kingly, sacrificial, divine. In each portrait, the evangelist sits calmly, eyes focused, scroll unrolled, as if caught mid-thought, paused not for the viewer, but for eternity itself. Behind them, the backgrounds are abstract. No landscapes, no interiors. Only sacred geometry, patterns of divine thought made visible. And beneath the portraits comes the text, line upon line of Latin scripture, arranged with meticulous care. Each letter drawn by hand, many adorned with curls, horns, and sweeping tails. Some initial letters are several inches tall, filled with abstract designs, animals, even human faces. Others are modest, demure, tucked into the corner, but none are careless. None are rushed. Even mistakes are handled with quiet dignity. A smudge here corrected with a careful dot, a forgotten word inserted delicately above the line. There is no haste in this book, only rhythm, like breath, like prayer. The Lindisfarne Gospels were not made to be read by the public. They were sacred objects, displayed on altars, carried in processions, read aloud only on holy days, and only by those trained to do so. Their pages were turned with reverence, their margins never scribbled on, and yet they were used, handled, understood. They were living manuscripts, part of worship, part of community. But what makes this manuscript even more remarkable is what came later. In the 10th century, more than 300 years after the manuscript was first made, a monk named Aldred added something extraordinary: a translation. In the narrow spaces between the Latin lines, he wrote a gloss, word for word, translations into Old English. He added a colophon too, a short note explaining who wrote the book, who bound it, who commissioned it, and why it mattered. Through Aldred's hand, the Lindisfarne Gospels became more than art. They became a bridge, from Latin to English, from monk to monk, from one century to the next. The book became a vessel, carrying not only the Word of God, but the quiet, careful labor of two men, separated by time, joined by faith. The Gospels did not vanish, despite Viking raids, despite wars and reformations, despite fire and neglect. The manuscript survived. Today, it rests in the British Library, its pages preserved behind glass, turned only by gloved hands. Pilgrims still come, not in robes, but in modern clothes. Scholars, tourists, artists, children, all drawn to this glowing window into the past. Some marvel at the detail, others at the patience it required. Still others at the quiet faith humming beneath every stroke. It is easy to forget in our world of screens and speed just what it means to make something slowly, to sit in silence, to work by hand, to devote a decade to a single book. The Lindisfarne Gospels are not loud. They are not gilded in gold or clothed in jewels. They do not command with force or fame. Instead, they whisper of stillness, of rhythm, of care. They remind us that beauty can come from repetition, that holiness can come from routine, that even in obscurity, greatness can grow. They remind us of a time when letters were sacred, when ink was prayer, when color was devotion. And if you lean close enough, if you let your breath slow, you might just hear the faint scratch of a quill, the quiet shuffle of sandals on stone, and the steady pulse of a monk's heart, echoing across 1,200 years. Let us linger a little longer and step beyond the pages into the world in which this manuscript was born. The Lindisfarne Gospels are part of a greater tradition, the style now known as Insular art. It blossomed in the British Isles in the early Middle Ages, blending Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Mediterranean influences. The Book of Kells in Ireland, the Book of Durrow, the Echternach Gospels all share this intricate, hypnotic aesthetic, but the Lindisfarne Gospels remain singular in their depth, not only for their beauty, but for their intention. Insular art was more than decorative. It was devotional geometry, a sacred code, visible, readable, memorable. To gaze at a carpet page was to walk a mental labyrinth. To trace the lines was to follow a spiritual path. To lose oneself in the spirals was to find the divine. It wasn't meant for distraction. It was meant for transformation. Okay? And where were these books kept? But eventually, they became part of the monastic library, not a grand space with rows of shelves, as in later centuries, but often just a chest or a cupboard near the altar. Sometimes a chained lectern so the book could be read, but not removed. These manuscripts were few and precious. Some monasteries may have had only 2 or 3, each one copied by hand, each one imbued with months, even years, of labor. Lindisfarne Gospels would have been the crown jewel, carried during major feast days, placed on the altar with reverence, opened not casually, but with ritual. It may even have been part of pilgrimages carried along the coast or inland, drawing the faithful toward Lindisfarne. But danger loomed. In 793 AD, just a few decades after the Gospels were completed, the island of Lindisfarne was attacked. The Viking raid shocked all of Christendom. It was the beginning of the Norse invasions of Britain and a turning point in monastic life. Scriptoria fell silent. Monks were killed or enslaved. Relics were hidden or destroyed. But the Lindisfarne Gospels were saved. They were taken with the relics of St. Cuthbert into hiding. The monks fled inland, carrying the sacred objects across rivers and forests. The manuscript traveled with them to Chesterle Street, to Ripon, and eventually to Derma, where Cuthbert's final resting place remains today. For over a century, the Gospels were on the move, safeguarded, protected, treated not just as a book, but as a person. This journey is important because it tells us something profound. The Lindisfarne Gospels were alive in the minds of the faithful, not just ink and parchment, but a vessel of divine presence. Its survival is not just a miracle of preservation, it's a testament to belief, to the monks who risked their lives to carry it, to the scribes who continued the tradition of copying by hand, to the communities who understood, even without reading Latin, that this was sacred work. And now, centuries later, we can still see the fingerprints of those who turned its pages, the faint rub of thumbs in the margins, the tiny impressions left by clasps that once held the book shut, the cracks where pigments lifted from the page. These are not flaws, they are echoes. Each one whispers, I was touched, I was held, I was used with love. The Lindisfarne Gospels are more than a medieval artifact. They are a record of time, devotion, migration, and memory. They tell a story, not just of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but of Edfrith, who drew them, of Aldred, who translated them, of the monks who carried them, and of the millions who have since beheld them in a modern world of instant messages and digital text, where letters flash and disappear, and books are replaced by screens. The Lindisfarne Gospels remain a quiet witness to patience, to presence, to the sacredness of creation. They ask nothing of us. They do not shout. They do not sell. They simply are. And if you sit with them long enough, if you let the rhythm of the script carry you, if you close your eyes and imagine the flicker of a candle beside the page, you might hear what they have been whispering for over 1,000 years. That beauty needs no noise. That meaning can be made slowly. That devotion, done in silence, leaves the deepest mark. Now, we leave behind the illuminated pages in sacred solitude and step into a different kind of power, not quiet, not introspective, but strategic, hierarchical, political. We've entered the world of abbots, bishops, and kings. The church, not merely as a sanctuary, but as an empire of influence. In the medieval world, monasteries were not isolated from society. They shaped it. They steered it. They often governed it. A great abbey, such as Cluny in France or Westminster in England, was not just a house of prayer. It was a vast estate, a legal entity, a financial institution. To walk into its gates was to step into a miniature kingdom, with its own rules, its own servants, its own farms, breweries, stables, and guards. At the center of it all stood the abbot. The title sounded humble, father, but the role often came with wealth, prestige, and political leverage. Abbeys held land granted by kings. They collected tithes and taxes. They hired reeves to manage their manors. They oversaw wool production, vineyards, and fisheries. Some abbots commanded armies of lay brothers and hired laborers. Others negotiated treaties on behalf of monarchs. A few even governed entire regions in the king's absence. In some places, an abbot held the title of prince. Consider Glastonbury Abbey. By the 12th century, it owned land in over 200 parishes. It hosted royal visits. It minted coins. It operated courts. The abbot of Glastonbury lived in a lavish residence with stained glass windows, painted walls, and private gardens. His meals were prepared by a full kitchen staff. He might dine on roasted fowl, fresh bread, and wine. His garments, though still ecclesiastical, might be trimmed in fur or decorated with embroidery. Not quite the austere image of monastic life, but wealth brought complications. The medieval church was not immune to ambition, and not every abbot came to his seat through piety. In many abbeys, powerful families secured positions for their sons. A bishopric or abbacy was a noble career, often more lucrative and secure than a knight's fief. Boys of 14 or 15 could be named abbots. Men with military backgrounds could don the habit, not out of devotion, but duty. This led to a troubling practice: simony. Simony, named after Simon Magus, who tried to buy spiritual powers from the apostles, was the buying and selling of church offices. It became widespread in the 10th and 11th centuries. Bishoprics, abbeys, even papal influence could be purchased. The seat of an abbot might be auctioned off to the highest bidder. In return, the buyer gained access to lands, income, and prestige, and then used the monastery's funds to recoup the cost. It was a cycle of corruption that reformers tried desperately to break. Enter the Cluniac reforms. In the 10th century, a monastery at Cluny in France attempted to restore spiritual discipline. Cluny's monks pledged direct allegiance to the Pope, bypassing local lords. They emphasized the rule of Saint Benedict: stability, obedience, poverty, prayer. prayer. Under Cluny's model, abbots were elected from within. Liturgical devotion was restored. Buildings were expanded not for comfort, but for the glory of God. This reform spread rapidly through hundreds of daughter houses. Cluniac abbots gained moral authority, even as other branches of the church remained entangled in feudal games. But even Cluny grew powerful. Its abbots presided over vast networks, and soon critics emerged. So came the Cistercians. In the 12th century, they stripped everything back. No stained glass, no painted walls, no excessive feasting, just stone, light, silence, work. Their abbeys were stark, remote, and ordered. Their daily lives marked by manual labor and long hours of chant offered a rebuke to the grandeur of Cluny. The Cistercian model, too, gained traction. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux became a household name across Christendom. But even the purest intentions could not fully avoid the shadow of politics. Meanwhile, back in the older, grander abbeys, the game of influence continued. Some abbots were appointed by kings, bypassing ecclesiastical election. Others were elected, but only after nobles leaned on the votes. And once in power, abbots had a seat at the table. Literally, in England, abbots of major houses were lords of parliament. They had voice and vote in the king's court. They could influence law, taxation, and war. They also served as diplomats. When tensions rose between kingdoms, it was often abbots who traveled abroad, offering peace, delivering letters, negotiating marriages, or trade. Their neutrality as men of God gave them unique leverage. But the role was not without danger. Consider Abbot Thurston of Glastonbury, who resisted King Henry II's attempts to seize monastic land. He was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually exiled. Or Abbot Samson of Bury St. Edmunds, chronicled by the monk Jocelyn of Brakeland. A humble, honest man, Samson fought tirelessly to defend his abbey from financial ruin and outside interference. He repaired the roof, restored the choir, even took on corrupt priors who skimmed from the stores. He ruled with justice, but also with iron. Within the abbey walls, politics could be equally complex. Not all monks agreed with their abbot. Some resented his authority. Others saw the abbey's wealth as a betrayal of their vows. Disputes arose over discipline, over privileges, over access to food, books, even firewood. Sometimes factions formed, one group loyal to the abbot, another to a rival monk. Letters were sent to bishops, complaints lodged with Rome. Papal legates arrived to sort out scandals. In some rare cases, abbots were deposed. An inquiry might reveal mismanagement, moral failure, or doctrinal error. Sometimes they stepped down in disgrace. Other times they fought using every legal channel to keep their seat. And yet, for all the conflict, many abbots genuinely sought to serve. They saw themselves as stewards, not just of land, but of souls. They funded hospitals, built bridges, fed the poor. They copied books, taught children, and offered sanctuary to the oppressed. The tension was always there between the spiritual and the temporal, between prayer and power. The Reformation in the 16th century would change everything. In England, under Henry VIII, the monasteries were dissolved, their lands seized, their treasures melted down, their abbots pensioned off or executed. Some fought, others surrendered. Monastic life, once the backbone of medieval society, was swept away in a few short decades. Abbeys fell into ruin. Libraries were burned. Centuries of continuity were broken. And yet, the legacy of the abbots remains. Their names are carved into stone lintels, their initials scrawled in old manuscripts. Their buildings, some now cathedrals, others silent ruins, still hold echoes. Their lives were not simple, not always holy, but deeply human, caught between heaven and earth, between ideal and reality, between the rule of silence and the roar of power. Today, when we walk through a ruined abbey, we see the grandeur, the symmetry, the arches and cloisters and towers. But behind those stones were people, monks who prayed, abbots who negotiated, communities who depended on the rhythm of bell and book. History remembers them in shadows. But if we listen, slowly, quietly, we can hear the layered voices of faith, ambition, duty, and doubt. Even as abbots climbed the social ladder, beneath them, ordinary monks continued their daily rhythm, their lives far removed from politics and privilege. A monk might rise before dawn, shivering in the unheated dormitory, wrap his habit tight, and join the procession toward the chapel. No silk, no fur-lined cloak, just wool and silence. While the abbot might prepare for a diplomatic journey or a correspondence with a king, the rest of the monastery would hum along in ritual simplicity, prayer, reading, copying texts, baking bread, tending sheep. The divide between abbot and monk could be stark, yet both lived within the same stone walls. Both heard the same bell. Both bowed at the same altar. One ruled, the other obeyed. One strategized, the other contemplated. But each, in theory, served the same God. Monasteries were also cultural hubs. They hosted feasts on saints' days, attracting pilgrims and noble guests. Abbots presided over these celebrations with ceremony, wearing jeweled mitres, carrying ornate staffs, delivering blessings from raised thrones. The liturgies were grand, the music solemn. Books were carried in processions. Holy relics, a bone, a scrap of cloth, were displayed for all to see. These events reminded the people not just of the abbey's spiritual role, but of its wealth, power, and place in the hierarchy of the realm. Even in prayer, there was spectacle. Yet, beneath the ceremonial layers, many abbots faced pressing worldly concerns. Harvest yields determined whether the monastery would feast or fast. Disputes over land could drain resources and incite violence. Royal taxes loomed large, especially in times of war. In some years, abbots had to sell relics or melt chalices just to pay the king's dues. Others borrowed from moneylenders, placing their abbeys in lasting debt. And when trouble came, a plague, a drought, a rebellion, the abbey was expected to provide for the poor, the sick, and the displaced. It was a delicate balance, opulence and obligation. As the Middle Ages advanced, networks of monasteries stretched across Europe. Some orders, like the Cluniacs, maintained centralized control, with the mother house at Cluny holding authority over daughter houses from Italy to Scotland. Others, like the Cistercians, opted for semi-autonomy, but maintained strict spiritual guidelines across hundreds of locations. This expansion gave abbots influence beyond their own abbey walls. They convened at synods, corresponded with distant monasteries, advised kings on theological matters, and occasionally military campaigns. The lines between spiritual and secular blurred further by the late medieval period. The image of the abbot prince had become familiar, sometimes even satirized in stories and plays. Authors poked fun at greedy monks and gluttonous abbots. Paintings depicted corpulent clergy at banquet tables while peasants starved. Such portrayals weren't always fair, but they reflected growing unease with ecclesiastical wealth. Among the laity, murmurs of reform grew louder, and so came the winds of change. By the early 1500s, humanists began to question the role of monasteries. Reformers like Martin Luther, himself a former monk, challenged not only indulgences and simony, but the entire monastic structure. In England, Henry VIII's break with Rome gave him a reason and the power to seize monastic lands. The dissolution of the monasteries followed. Between 1536 and 1541, hundreds of abbeys were closed. Monks and nuns were turned out. Gold and silver were confiscated. Libraries were scattered. Buildings were left to ruin or repurposed as private estates. Some abbots resisted and paid with their lives. Others accepted pensions and faded into retirement. 1,000 years of continuity, undone in a few short years. And yet, not all was lost. Some abbeys were transformed into cathedrals, like Westminster. Others became schools, colleges, or parish churches. In time, the ruins became places of reflection. Today, visitors walk through roofless halls and ivy-covered cloisters. They stand in empty naves where monks once chanted. They gaze at worn stones, imagining the processions, the prayers, the politics. And in some places, the abbots are still remembered. Their names carved into chapter house walls. Their tombs marked with weathered inscriptions. Their legacy complex but enduring. To study these abbots is to encounter the contradictions of power. They were men of God and men of the world. They wore sandals and seals of office. They spoke of humility, but ruled over lands and laborers. Some were saints, some were scoundrels, many were simply navigating the narrow path between heaven and earth. As you drift now into silence, picture a great abbey at dusk. The sun glows behind arched windows. Chant rises from the choir. A heavy wooden door closes quietly behind the abbot as he returns to his chamber. Robes rustling, thoughts deep with tomorrow's burdens. In the courtyard, a novice sweeps the flagstones. In the scriptorium, a monk copies a final line. In the dormitory, candles are snuffed. And in the bell tower, a single chime rings out, calling the community once more to prayer, even in their power. They were still bound by rhythm, by bell, by vow, by the eternal turning of the hours. And now, as the last candle dims in the abbey, as the echo of the evening bell fades into stillness, we return to ourselves. We have wandered through 1,000 years, from the cold stone cloisters of Dark Age monasteries to the windswept hermitage of St. Cuthbert, to the glowing pages of the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the towering halls of abbots who held both crozier and crown. We have seen devotion and doubt, silence and struggle. We have listened to the rhythm of ancient bells, felt the scratch of a quill on vellum, heard the slow chant of a life bound by rule. It was a world shaped by faith, sometimes sincere, sometimes strategic, but always steady. A world where time moved slowly, where hours were counted in prayers, where life was marked not by ambition, but by ritual. Now you lie still, not on a straw mattress in a cold dormitory, but in the comfort of your own space. No bells will wake you, no matins to recite, no manuscript to finish by candlelight. You are free to rest, free to drift, free to let your thoughts slow, like the soft turning of an ancient page. Let your breath follow the rhythm of the monastic day, a rising, a pause, a return. Let the silence of the cloister settle over you. Let the quiet dedication of forgotten monks whisper through your dreams. You are no longer walking the muddy paths of Lindisfarne. You are not bent over inkpots and pigments. You are not navigating the corridors of power in a royal abbey. You are here, now, safe, and the past will keep its vigil as you sleep.